Hello, sci-fi and philosophy students. Today I'm going to be talking about the rest of that reading by John Stuart Mill and talking about his utilitarianism. And also, before I get into dealing with the rest of Mill's writing that I had you guys look at for today, I will respond to some of the student short assignments that I received where students raised questions or presented challenges to Mill's utilitarianism. I received four essays on that. Some folks, don't forget, students, it is important that you do these short assignments. It counts towards both your short assignment score and your class participation score. So if you're not doing them, that will hurt your participation and short assignment score for the second half of the semester. Anyway, also before I get into some of this, let me remind you guys that all of you have papers due on Friday, April 10. That's tomorrow by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That paper assignment's been out for quite a while. And for next Tuesday, I want you guys to watch a movie. It's a science fiction movie. It stars Bruce Willis. And it's called Surrogates. It is my hope you would be able to access this through Amazon Prime or Netflix or perhaps some other source. You might be able to find it on YouTube. I just don't know. And, if you cannot access Surrogates, it's not crucial that you see it. But if you can watch it, I would encourage you to do so. It's a pretty good movie, and it ties in well with a short reading I want you to do for next time. For next time, I want you to read a short excerpt. I'm going to send that excerpt to you as a scanned document. It's a little piece by Robert Nozick. It's quite short, and it's called The Experience Machine. And there, Nozick presents something that could be taken as a challenge to some things that Mill says in his writings on utilitarianism. Let's see. Also, Group A students, those of you in Group A, you will have a short writing assignment due next Tuesday by 8 in the morning. And I plan on responding to some of those short writings in my next lecture. Anyway, I will send you guys an email about these things either this afternoon or Friday afternoon. With the excerpt from Robert Nozick and the instructions for the Group A students in their short assignment. Now, having said all that, let's talk some more about utilitarianism. Before I launch in, let me just remind you that utilitarianism, right, this is the view that in living our lives and in making decisions, we should always seek, right, we should always seek to do the actions that lead to the greater happiness for the greater number. It's all right to consider your own happiness in making decisions in life, but you should not treat your own happiness as any more important than the happiness of other beings that may be affected by your actions, right? And certainly I spoke about this on Tuesday, this theory of ethics, this theory about what it is right for us to do and how we should live our lives. And some students did the short assignment and had things to say about this view, and I'd like to respond to some of those right now. What have I got here? I've got something here. Let's see. Here's something from Alex Tomes. Alex Tomes made two different points pressing possible challenges to Mill's utilitarianism. Her first point, Alex Tomes writes, Mill argues that people sufficiently acquainted with both the higher and lower pleasures prefer the higher over the lower pleasures. Tomes says, but I believe this is not necessarily true. It is conceivable that someone may have been to college or otherwise engaged in the acquisition of knowledge and then decided that they did not enjoy it. Could it then be said that this individual prefers the lower pleasures to the higher pleasures? Right. I think I actually made a comment like this in my last lecture that, and I think I acknowledged that I too sometimes have some skepticism about Mill's claim that the pleasures derived from good food, good drink, good sex, um, and good back rubs, whatever. Um, I said in my last lecture that I too sometimes have skepticism, and the source of my skepticism is something very much what what Alex talks about here. I pointed out in my prior lecture that I'm frequently trying to encourage students to take pleasure in philosophy, um, and other professors are trying to get students to take pleasure in the sciences and in math and in history, and oftentimes students still seem to prefer just getting drunk, having sex, eating good food, etc. But I think, one thing that Mill might say, Alex, is that perhaps just going to college and just having spent a semester studying philosophy or just having spent a couple of years studying science, it does not, right? It does not necessarily mean that one has sufficiently well immersed oneself in the life of the mind. And so the mere fact that somebody has spent a few years studying science or philosophy or history or whatever, or in this practice of law, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've sufficiently well immersed themselves into those practices to be sufficiently acquainted with the intellectual life and to be sufficiently acquainted with the life of pleasure. And so we might want to say that, those college students who just don't take to the life of the mind, maybe they've never really given it enough effort and put enough of themselves into it to really enjoy the pleasures that come from it. It's a move he could make. But, again, I think that, Alex, I think you actually make an interesting point. And, what might really trouble Mill's position here is imagine somebody like me who's really devoted very significant portions to his life, as I have done, to intellectual inquiry. And then imagine that just tomorrow I say, those pleasures, I just come to the conclusion, what? That has been time wasted on these intellectual efforts. I'd be just as happy or happier getting drunk and laid all the time. And I'm just going to do that from now on. That I think might be more of a challenge for Mill. Now, does that ever happen? I suspect it does sometimes happen. Sometimes I suspect there are cases of people that have led these intellectual or artistic lives, and then one day just woken up and said, I'm wasting my time with this. I'm just going to go for the lower pleasures. Then I think Mill's position might be challenged. But at the same time, Mill might even push back there and might say, that perhaps there's something mentally, maybe only somebody with a mental health problem might come to that conclusion or something. And so it's not really a rational move on someone's part if they do that. So anyway, it's an interesting issue, I think, that you push there, Alex, though I have spoken to it a bit last time. Now, Alex also writes, another point I wish to ask is, where do human needs factor into happiness? If seeking better food is a base pleasure, it should not be completely ignored, as humans need to eat in order to pursue these higher pleasures. I think human base needs are equally important to the pursuit of higher happiness, as without the lower you cannot have the higher, and without the higher, well, a human's life is merely less enriched, which is not always the worst thing. That's interesting. It seems to me, Alex, what you're pushing here is that you seem to be suggesting that, we actually need to satisfy our desires for food and drink in order to survive, and we have to continue to survive if we are to engage in the higher pleasures. And so, there are certain needs that involve satisfying the lower pleasures so that we can even engage in the higher pleasures. And I think Mill is going to say, yes, absolutely, Alex. We all do need to have some food and some drink, and perhaps we do need to engage in other lower pleasures like sexual activity, or receiving back rubs from time to time. Maybe we need some of this in order to flourish uh, in the arts and sciences and the study of law and medicine and things like this. Maybe we need some of that, and I think that's perfectly consistent with Mill's philosophy. I think Mill might want to encourage us to indulge in some of the lower pleasures, but only just enough indulgence to make us better at doing philosophy, science, math, medicine, law, and right. Um, so I think Mill might want to say our indulgence in the lower pleasures really should serve the ends of our getting more of the higher pleasures while engaging in intellectual inquiry, the study and practice of medicine and law and philosophy and physics and art and what have you. You see what I'm getting at? I think so. Mill could support, and I think would support some pursuit of the lower pleasures. They shouldn't be completely ignored because we need to do some of that to remain mentally healthy and to even survive. So those are a few things that Alex wrote about, and I think they're worthy of consideration here. Let's look to something else here. I've got something from Jake Schmidt. Jake Schmidt, he wrote something, and Jake Schmidt writes, I'm looking at the last paragraph of his essay. Jake Schmidt writes, according to Mill, higher pleasures involve intellectual and moral engagement. If we were to act in a way to promote the greatest happiness or pleasure, shouldn't we always give all that we have to others? Giving away all of our property and materials, such as food and money, would deprive us of lower pleasures, but we would obtain the higher moral pleasure of giving to others. This seems impossible to live this way, at least in our current world. If everyone were to follow utilitarianism to the full extent, would this balance out for everyone? Now, Jake, I think you do raise an interesting issue here, though the way you've got it is a bit confusing to me. But basically, Jake, I take you to be pointing out that if we take utilitarianism seriously, then, and if we're equally concerned with the sufferings and the welfare of others, and if then we should be right. Then we should be. Jake, I take it you're suggesting that we should be trying to stamp out, that we should be taking measures to stamp out and reduce poverty and hunger and disease that exist among many parts of the human population. We should be looking to stamp that out. And so we should be spending significant portions of our wealth to give to charities. And if we're all giving so much to charity to stamp out disease, poverty, hunger, things like this, well, you seem concerned that this would be bad. You say this seems impossible to live this way in our current world. Jake, and I've got a suspicion that what you have in mind is that if all of the people who've got money and who can afford good homes and good food and good drink, if they all start giving their money away to provide food for the hungry and the poor and the sick, this might, I guess maybe what you're suggesting, this might be damaging to our economy. You might want to make the point that, look, our economy is driven by, conspicuous consumption of consumer goods. And if we all just start giving our monies away to charity, then this might damage our economy such that we're all worse off in the long run because our economy might be damaged. And then we might even have people losing jobs, less money in people's pockets if we're not engaged in conspicuous consumption of more good food and good drink and fine cars and fine houses than we need. And this might actually have bad utilitarian consequences. But I want to point out, if Mill's philosophy is right, and if your visions of how the economy operates, if that's correct, then maybe we should not be giving too much of our money away for the sick, the hungry, the poor, and the needy. Maybe this should be done, incrementally and with reservations so that we don't damage our capitalist economy. Um, and so, it's not obvious that if utilitarianism is true, then we should be driving ourselves into poverty by giving so much away to the sick, the poor, the hungry, etc. Furthermore, it might also be that if enough of us if enough of us gave a little bit, if everybody gave just a little bit, this might take us a long way to solving problems of hunger and poverty, etc. And then it wouldn't damage the economy at the same time, and so there would still be enough for us to spend on luxury items. Um, so it's not obvious that um, our giving to charities, which does seem called for, that we must go all in on giving to charity and be giving to the point where we ourselves are hurting. Um, and so it's not obvious that utilitarians have to be driven to that conclusion, Jake. But I wish this was something where we could just sit and talk about this more. Um, because there is more to be said on this front. I won't address Jake's point further, but I hope, Jake, I've given you something to think about and given something for others to think about as well, other students in the class. Let's look at a couple of others. I have something. Yes, well, Leo Wheeler. Leo Wheeler has expressed some concerns about Mill's philosophy. Wheeler writes, within Mill's, or I'm looking at the first paragraph of Leo Wheeler's essay, and what Wheeler does is he jumps right in and presents what he sees as a problem with Mill's philosophy, and then he develops his point with some detailed examples. But the general point from Wheeler is that within Mill's article, Mill argues that the basis of all human desire is happiness. Mill also defines happiness as pleasure in the absence of pain. I can't bring myself to believe this, says Wheeler. There are actions performed by humans every day where the goal is not happiness. The best way I can seem to describe this is through the world of fitness and athletics. And what Wheeler does, Wheeler goes on to argue that, look, I'm not doing, when I'm, Wheeler goes on, Wheeler has the no pain, no gain philosophy of lifting weights and running. And Wheeler says that he's not out to make himself happy when he's lifting weights until it hurts and he's running until it hurts. He says he's not out to bring himself happiness there. He's out to put himself into a position of pain. And Wheeler talks about how football coaches yell at their players, exhorting them to work hard, right? Even angering their football players so as to get them to do better in practice and in the games, right? And so the coaches aren't looking to make their players happy. The athletes are not looking to please themselves when they're lifting weights and running to the point of pain. And so Wheeler wants to use those examples illustrating that it's not true that our only goal in life is to secure happiness. Nor is it true that should be our only goal. But I think, let me just say, Wheeler, I think Hume's going to challenge the examples you present here. I mean, I think Mill's going to say, sure. Leo, when you and other athletes are putting yourself in pain during your weightlifting workouts and your running workouts, and for that matter, when your coaches are making you angry and frustrated in practice, right? I think Mill's is gonna ask you, Leo, what is the point? What is the point of your enduring pain in your weightlifting and running? What is the point of the coach making you angry and frustrated in practice? Well, Mill's gonna say, look, the point is to make you a better athlete and a better football player, right? And what is the point of making you a better athlete and better football player? It's so that you will succeed as an athlete and football player, and your team will succeed, right? And what is the point of the success of your team? Um, it's so that you and your teammates will have the pleasure of succeeding in football and doing well in football, right? And it's perfectly consistent with Mill's philosophy that we will do some things that are painful and difficult in order to arrive at something that brings a greater pleasure that makes those pains and difficulties all worthwhile, right? Sometimes, in my own life, I find myself studying philosophical texts so that I might learn from them, and I might struggle and be pained as I'm trying to get through a difficult philosophical text, and maybe in some levels not enjoying it, but that's so that I might learn something from it and acquire some knowledge that will make me a better philosopher. But what's the point of being the better philosopher? It's so that I can enjoy the pleasures that come from philosophical enlightenment and maybe pass that philosophical enlightenment on to others so that they too can derive the pleasures that come from philosophical inquiry. So that I think is what Mill will say in response to the issue you raised, Leo. And so I leave that for you to think about. Let's look at one more. I know I'm going on a bit, but I think I'll be able to get through my lecture on the rest of Mill's utilitarian writing that you had for today. I think I can get through that fairly quickly. Let's look at another one of these. Maybe one other. I've got something here from Max Velo. And Velo, he too's got an objection to utilitarianism. Max Velo writes, an objection I have to utilitarianism is how it would disregard actions done against someone without their knowledge. Velo gives an interesting example. Velo says, consider that I am in my room changing clothes and someone happens to take an unflattering picture of me while I'm doing so, and they take this picture without my knowing that they're taking the picture. Velo continues, I never come to know that these pictures exist. However, if I did know, I would be unhappy that they do exist. The individual that took these pictures of me naked, he happens to share said pictures with a group of friends that get enjoyment out of them. Using John Stuart Mill's principle of utilitarianism, since there is no harm to my happiness, the individual did not act wrongly. In fact, he acted rightly by taking such pictures of me. However, as a society, we know that this is an unjust act by the perpetrator. Therefore, Mill's view on happiness and utilitarianism seems to be mistaken. Perhaps this presents a significant problem for Mill's philosophy. So, what Velo is getting at here is Mill says we should always do the action that leads to the greater happiness for the greater number. And Velo makes the point that, well, suppose somebody has a way to take pictures of Max while he's naked, and Max doesn't know that these pictures are being taken, and then this pervert, he's got perverted friends, and he shares a picture with his perverted friends, and they take pleasure in looking at these. And Velo doesn't know that his privacy's been violated, and his friends are taking pleasure from they're taking some perverted pleasure in looking at these. And so it looks like this is a utility maximizing enterprise, violating people's privacy to enhance people's perverted pleasure. And Velo wants to say that seems obviously wrong to violate people's privacies in this way. And yet utilitarianism would seem to endorse this. This, I think, might be a serious problem with utilitarianism. One thing that Mill could say is that, there's a couple of things that Mill could say, I suppose. One thing that Mill could say is, when the person takes these pictures, he doesn't really know if he and his perverted friends will be found out by the law or by others. And he doesn't really know whether Velo will find out. And Mill could argue that it's not really worth the risk. It's not really worth the risk to Velo's happiness. And it's not really worth the risk of being caught to engage in this violation of privacy just to bring about the perverse pleasure of this one person and his friends. So that if you actually do the utilitarian calculation and think about the utilitarian calculation before the pictures are taken, the proper utilitarian conclusion would be, don't do it. Now, as it turns out, they never get caught and they're happy, right? This peeping Tom and his perverted friends. But Mill could say that they're still not doing the utilitarian right thing because they just got lucky, right? Mill could say something like that. Another thing that Mill could say is that the long-term consequence of these people taking perverse pleasure in looking at the naked pictures of Max, the long-term consequence of satisfying these perverse pleasures is just the encouragement of further perversion on the part of these people. But encouraging perversion does not have good long run happiness maximization potential. And so, this could lead to an argument by Mill that this isn't really happiness maximizing, because it's not happiness maximizing to be encouraging perversion, sexual perversion within the population. I don't know how plausible these two defenses of Mill are, Max, but I throw them out there as potential ways that that Mill might respond to the objection you raise. And again, I'm grateful to those of you who sent in these short assignments, because they do present, each of you has presented something worth considering and talking about. And if the rest of the class watches this, they might learn something from this exchange of ideas that I've had with the four of you who did this short assignment. So I appreciate your doing this. Let's turn to materials for today. I know that in the reading that you had for today, John Stuart Mill, he continues to consider objections to the utilitarian philosophy and answer them. And I do want to look at least a few of those other objections to utilitarian philosophy that he answers. Before doing so, though, I want to talk about what I regard as the general argument for utilitarianism, and I want to talk about the hedonistic theory of value that underlies Mill's utilitarianism, and I want to explain the defense that Mill gives for hedonism in the reading that you had for today. But again, let me remind you, right? So utilitarianism, this is the view that we ought to always do those actions that lead to the greater happiness for the greater number of those people affected by our actions. And in doing so, we're to treat every being's happiness equally in our calculation of what it is right to do. That's what utilitarianism amounts to. And the question could be raised, why does Mill think we should live our lives that way? And I think that the core argument from Mill can be articulated as follows. And I'm looking at the outline here. Again, hopefully if you're watching the video, you could have the video open on one window of your computer and have the outline open in another window. But I think that the basic argument behind Mill's utilitarianism is as I have it on the outline. Point one, we should always seek to maximize whatever is good in itself, that is, whatever is intrinsically good. Happiness is the only thing that's intrinsically good, it's the only thing that's good in itself. Therefore, we should always seek to maximize happiness. I think Mill also believes, point four, there's nothing that makes any one being's happiness any more important than the happiness of any other being. So in seeking to maximize happiness, every being's happiness should be counted equally. Therefore, utilitarianism is true, right? Just backing up here, let's just stop and look at point one here for a moment. Mill believes that we should always seek to maximize whatever is intrinsically good. And just to be clear about this, things that are intrinsically good are good in themselves, right? All things that are good are either good in themselves or good as a means to something else, right? And Mill thinks that the only thing that's good in itself is happiness. And all of the other things, according to Mill, that we say are good, such as money and knowledge and health and beauty, according to Mill, all of those other things that we say are good, money, fame, health, knowledge, beauty, all those other things are good just as a means to securing happiness, right? And so happiness, he says, is the only thing that's good in itself. And since we should always seek to maximize what's intrinsically good, he thinks we should always seek to maximize happiness. Now, that raises the question, whose happiness should we seek to maximize? Just our own? Just our families? Just our neighborhood's happiness? Mill seems to think that there's really nothing that makes any one being's happiness or any one family's happiness or any one neighborhood's happiness. There's nothing that makes any one being's happiness more important than the happiness of anyone else. And if that's true, then we should be equally concerned with the happiness of all beings that might be affected by our actions, right? So when seeking to maximize happiness, every being's happiness should be counted equally, right? But this then just means that utilitarianism is true. And I do think that these are the core ideas supporting Mill's utilitarianism. Now, I would point out that when Mill says that happiness is the only thing that's intrinsically good, that's controversial, and that needs some argument. And Mill, in the later parts of the reading that you had for today, Mill argues that happiness is the only thing that's intrinsically good. Okay? First of all, I'll point out the belief that happiness is the only thing that's good in itself, the only thing that's intrinsically good, that is called hedonism. So, right, and we say that John Stuart Mill is a hedonist about intrinsic value. And in the later parts of the reading for today, he argues in defense of hedonism. And his defense of hedonism, it gives support for premise 2 in his main argument for utilitarianism, premise 2 on our outline. So how does Mill argue for hedonism in the later parts of the reading? Well, I boiled this down into a 5-step argument on the handout. And I take this to be what Mill is arguing. Look, anything people desire as an end goal and not as a means to something else is intrinsically good. Happiness, it is desired as an end goal. So happiness is intrinsically good. Anything else people desire as an end goal, such as virtue or fame or money or knowledge or beauty, anything else people desire as an end goal is a part of a person's happiness. So happiness really is the only intrinsic good. That's how I think Mill is arguing for this in the later parts of the reading for today, right? And, notice point 2 says happiness is desired as an end goal by persons. See, that seems to me to be dead right. I mean, why are you listening to this video right now? So that you can learn the material for the course. Why are you learning the material for the course? Because you want to get a good grade in the course. Why do you want a good grade in the course? Because you want a good GPA. Why do you want a good GPA? Because you want to maximize your chances at getting a good job or getting into a good graduate program when you're done at Co. Why do you want a good job? So you can make good money. Why do you want to make good money? So that you can spend it on things for your family and for yourself. Why do you want to spend money on things for your family or yourself? Because you like having things. Why do you like having things? Because it makes you happy. Why do you want to be happy? Because I want to be happy. Well, but why do you want to be happy? Because I want to be happy, damn it. There's no, right. The end goal for each one of us, it seems, in whatever we're doing is our own happiness, right? And all these other things that we're doing are being done as a means to our happiness. And it seems quite clear that all of us have our own happiness as an end goal for ourselves. That's not to say that we're not concerned about the welfare of others, but it's clear that we all value our own happiness as an end goal. And so it seems right to say that happiness is an end goal for ourselves. And for Mill, that means that happiness is something intrinsically good. Now, Mill acknowledges that people will pursue things like, sometimes people pursue virtue or fame or money or promote their own good looks as end goals as well. But Mill wants to say that whenever somebody treats those things as an end goal, treats money or fame or health as an end goal, Mill believes that what's going on there is having those things, money, fame, health, is just part of that person's conception of happiness. And so for Mill, happiness just is the only thing that's good in itself. And Mill thinks it's important for him to defend the view that happiness is the only thing intrinsically good, because if you look at my account of his general argument for utilitarianism, it's based on the presumption that happiness is the only thing that's intrinsically good. And Mill recognizes he needs to defend that, to defend his philosophy, and that's why he argues for it in the reading that you have for today. Now, Mill does other things in the reading for today as well. He spends a good bit of time in the reading that you have presenting other objections to his philosophy and then answering those objections. And I want to walk through a few of those. I've got them here on the outline. I don't know that I have a whole lot more to add to these. Here's one objection. A critic of utilitarianism might say, happiness is unattainable in this life. We cannot be happy in this life. Therefore, utilitarianism is false because promoting happiness should not be our goal, because we just cannot be happy in this life. That's kind of a depressing objection. Look, Mill responds to this with skepticism. Mill thinks this is not a good objection. Mill is willing to acknowledge that having a life filled with constant states of bliss in this life, being constantly giddy and pleased, that's not attainable. Life presents us with lots of challenges and lots of moments of frustration and disappointment, the loss of loved ones, unrequited loves, illness. Nobody can be happy all the time. Mill's perfectly willing to grant that. No one can be happy all the time. But Mill wants to say we can still have lives and live lives that are on the whole happy, because we can live lives where the balance of the life is spent in happiness as opposed to unhappiness. Sure, just thinking about my own life, there have been moments of sadness. I've lived through the death of my mother, the death of my father, the death of one of my brothers. I've had girls break my heart. I've had failures in my career at moments. Right? So there've been plenty of moments and periods of times where I was not happy. But at the same time, my life on the whole may be happy, because while there are those moments of sadness, there still might be a greater majority of moments and moments of significant happiness which outweigh the moments of sadness in my life, such that on the whole, my life can be happy, right? And I suspect some of you, if you think about your own lives, you might find that your lives are on the whole happy, while there are moments and periods of sadness. And so, for this reason, Mill doesn't find the objection to be plausible. Mill also does make the point that even if happy lives are unattainable, it would still be consistent with the utilitarian philosophy to take actions in living our lives so as to minimize the sufferings of people in this world. And that's another way that he responds to this objection. I think Mill's response here, I find it quite plausible, to be honest. Mill considers another objection in the reading that you had. This objection runs, you cannot expect human beings to always act from the motive of promoting universal happiness. So utilitarianism expects too much of us, and so we should reject utilitarianism. Right? The objection here is that, I think at a certain level, the objection here is that people are too concerned with their own well-being and the well-being of their own families or the well-being of their own communities. And they're too focused on their own lives and maybe the lives of their families or friends. And you can't expect them to be constantly seeking to maximize the happiness of everyone in living their lives, because that's just not how the human mind works. We're too concerned with ourselves and our friends and our families. Right? But Mill thinks this objection's not very powerful either. I think what Mill wants to say is that the point of his philosophy is not that we should always act from such utility-maximizing motives, but that the right thing for us to do, regardless of our motive, is the actions that promote the greater happiness. Right? So I think what Mill is suggesting here is he's giving a theory about what makes an action right. And on Mill's view, an action is right when it promotes the greater happiness of all those affected by our action. And at a certain level, I think Mill doesn't really care what our motive is in acting, as long as we're doing the actions that lead to the greater happiness. That's all that matters morally. So, Mill might think that it's all right for me to act from motives of self-interest on some occasion, as long as the action that results from my self-interest promotes the greater happiness for all. For instance, if I see a car barreling down on me, and then out of self-interest, I jump out of the way of the car, that's a self-interested action. I'm not jumping out of the way of the car because I think it's utility maximizing. I'm doing it to protect myself. But notice, in protecting myself, I do something that conduces to my happiness, but also I'm doing something that conduces to the happiness of my wife, my 3 children, my friends who care about me. And so in acting in this selfish way, jumping out of the way of the car that's barreling down on me, I'm doing something that's utility maximizing, but I'm not acting from the motive of utilitarianism. I'm acting out of self-interest. And Mill thinks it's all right for us to do some things out of self-interest or to do things out of interest of our families, when doing so conduces to the greater happiness. The point of his philosophy is to describe what it is in fact right to do. The point is not to tell us precisely which motives to act on every situation. And Mill doesn't think you always have to act on the motives of utilitarianism to be acting rightly. And I think Mill actually makes a good point in response to that objection as well. I'm looking at my outline here. The next objection is got a misstatement. On the outline it says emotivism is a godless doctrine. That was not intended. That should say utilitarianism is a godless doctrine, so we should reject it. Some critics might say utilitarianism, that's a godless doctrine. It's contrary to Christian principles for us to always be maximizing utility. Therefore, we should reject utilitarianism. Somebody might say that. Mill's reply to this. Mill wants to say, look, it is reasonable to think that God would want us to be happy and to act for the happiness of all. Therefore, utilitarianism is not inconsistent with good old Christian values. I think Mill would want to say that. Um, right? There's a certain sense in which Mill might want to say the second great commandments, which tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves. Perhaps Mill would want to say that to love your neighbors as yourselves is to treat their interest and their own pursuit of happiness as equally important alongside your own happiness. And Mill might even want to endorse a reading of the second great commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, as an exhortation to be, right, to live your life in such a way as you treat others with equal respect for their happiness alongside your own. And that seems to be perfectly in line with utilitarianism. So Mill does not see his philosophy as running counter to central tenets of important religions like that of Christianity, or for that matter, really Judaism or Islam, or maybe other faiths might be relevant as well. So maybe one other objection. Another objection states that to live as a utilitarian, we would have to constantly be trying to discern what will lead to greater happiness. But we don't have time and the ability to be constantly figuring this out. So we should reject utilitarianism. There's an objection. Right? Look at that first premise. To live as a utilitarian, we would have to be constantly trying to figure out what will lead to the greater happiness. Right? According to utilitarianism, I should always do the action that leads to the greater happiness, right? And so the objection here is that, so for anything that I do, I have to be constantly asking myself, will this lead to the greater happiness? Should I look at the short assignments that were turned in today? Gosh, will that lead to the greater happiness? Should I record a video and show and post it on YouTube? Oh, will that lead to the greater happiness? Let me think about this. Should I scratch my head right now or pick my nose on video right now? Will that lead to the greater happiness? Oh, what should I do? And right, so the critic is thinking, well, to say that the right action is always that which leads to the greater happiness, it would lead us into constant states of reflection and trying to make the calculations to figure out what will lead to the greater happiness. And we don't have the time or ability to figure out what's going to lead to the greater happiness in all of these different, with respect to all the different choices and actions we have to do in living our lives. And so this is absurd and we should reject utilitarianism, or so goes the objection. Mill's reply to this, I have on the outline that what Mill seems to want to say here is that, look, there are many things that we have learned over time and throughout history. There are many things that we have learned both historically and in living our own lives. There are many things that we've learned which tell us how to act so as to promote happiness. So it's just not true, according to Mill, that we have to constantly be calculating what actions will lead to the greater happiness. Look, it's fairly obvious. When students do writing assignments, you should look at them and take note of them and record the assignment as being done. This doesn't require any utilitarian calculations. We know that it contributes to the greater happiness to look at the student assignment, develop some response to them, and record them as the assignment done. It doesn't take any genius to know that it's not going to facilitate the total happiness if I pick my nose while giving lectures. It just grosses everyone out. And so I don't have to spend time calculating, God, should I pick my nose right now during the lecture? No, I mean, we all know immediately this is not utility maximizing. We also know that lectures should be given at the assigned times when one is a teacher. It doesn't take any significant utilitarian calculation to figure out what would be utility maximizing to do in the great majority of things that we do. And so it's not like we have to struggle and think about at each moment and each step of our lives, God, what will lead to greater happiness here? Or what will lead to the greater happiness there? Um, because so many things are just sort of immediately and obviously inconsistent with utility maximization, and other things clearly do serve utility maximization. So it's not like we're going to have to be constantly stopping and puzzling and asking ourselves, what will maximize utility here? What will maximize utility there? Mill just finds that implausible. Um, and so he thinks this is not a good objection either. Um, Look, I haven't covered every objection that Mill considers in the reading that we have from Mill, but I have covered a number of them. 4 objections I covered today. I covered the swine objection last time. Also, I've addressed objections that were submitted by 4 students for today's class meeting. Um, Look, we'll encounter objections to Mill's utilitarianism and some of the things that we cover next week. And I think that some of the science fiction films I want you to watch will also suggest potential problems with utilitarianism, and that's why I'm having you look at surrogates. I think also next week I might have you guys watching a movie called The Truman Show next week as well. And I think The Truman Show presents some difficulties with utilitarianism. In fact, I think it presents difficulties for utilitarianism that are akin to the difficulty raised by Max Velo in his short assignment for today. Anyway, I hope you guys are well. I hope you guys are taking the time to watch these videos. Even if you're not, I think at least some are. Hopefully getting something out of it. You guys have a good day. Take care. Bye bye.